the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, OACPS, the GIZ Move Com Cashew Project, the Cashew Club, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative. Before I bring in Jem, we would like to remind you that we are just 27 days to the 2026 ACA at the La Palm Royal Beach Hotel in Accra, Ghana, from the 15th to the 18th September 2026. The conference will be on the theme Sustainable Cashew Supply Through Policy, Investment, and Partnership. Early bird registration period ends in 11 days on the 31st of August 2026. Register now and secure your spots at reduced rates. This is an opportunity for you to join hundreds of cashew stakeholders to network, share experiences, and discuss the future of the cashew industry. Register now. Good morning, Jim. Jim, can you hear me?
Good morning, Isaac. How are you?
Very well. How are you too?
Yeah, I'm okay. Check for me. Can you see my slideshow?
Yes, I can see your slides.
Well, that's good. I've been having a few technical glitches this morning.
Oh. Okay, so we have an interesting topic today, and hand over to you to take over in the discussion.
Well, I hope people find it interesting. We're going to talk about a little bit about the markets and especially about the supply of raw cashew nuts for India and for Vietnam. That's not something that we focus on too often in too much detail. And then we will have a look at, as Isaac was saying, on the lessons from the 2026 season. I've been in this a long time and I'm still learning. And it's really important that we try to draw the lessons from everything we do. Of course, but particularly from this rather volatile business that we all find ourselves in. So we'll have a look at those. But let's start off by having a look at today's markets. Let's have a brief overview and then we'll focus in on some of the trade trends and some of the statistics. So we've started the Southern Hemisphere season. It's now 19th of August and it's underway in Indonesia, in Brazil, and in Tanzania. There are some concerns on the weather. Of course, this is a year with a big impact from El Nino. That's probably not at its maximum yet. It's probably not having a big impact on what's being harvested at the moment, but it may well do in the coming months. So right now there are some concerns on weather. It's a bit unseasonably cool in Indonesia. It's a little bit dry. And in Tanzania, there's some talk about disruption of the supply of inputs, although I would have to say that the information on that is contradictory. In some quarters, there's no problem. In others, they're saying there is a problem. Early in September, we will have a session, hopefully with some representatives from the industry in Tanzania, and they will fill us in a little bit more on that. Vietnam, I've done some calculations on the running inventory of raw cashew nuts in Vietnam, and it seems to have tightened, and we focus on the period April to July. Now, when we look at that, again, the green bars are imports from Africa, the top 3 countries. The trend is much more noticeable. So we said that there was a fall off in first half imports from West Africa, but now we look at West Africa and we see that that's much more significant. So if we just take April to July since 2023, we see that the top 3 countries trade with Vietnam is down by 35%. That's really quite significant. That suggests that Vietnamese buyers are buying later. It doesn't necessarily mean they're buying less. They may well be buying less, but we don't know that till the end of the year. It does mean that they're buying later, and it does mean that there's probably more material afloat today and probably more material left in West Africa. in warehouses for export as raw cashew nuts, and possibly even on farms, although that's less likely. So this is a very significant number. It's down 35% on last year. It's down 41% of 2023. There is something definitely going on here. And we're going to come back to that as one of the key lessons from the season so far. Let's have a look at exports. So we've said that exports are just slightly down, and I've said my opinion that that's a pretty remarkable performance so far in the course of the year. Here's the monthly percentage variation. So we're looking at monthly exports from Vietnam to all destinations, month by month, the percentage change during 2026 compared to 2025. What we see is, first of all, an incredible January. Huge exports in January. The US was big, China was big in January. It wouldn't be surprising that if January was so big, that February would be well down. That's not at all surprising. The fact is that there's timing of festivals, there's replenishing inventories from prior years, there's the volatility created by US import tariffs, all contribute to those factors. But what's more interesting and surprising is that March, April, and May were also significantly down year on year. Only when we get to June and latterly to July do we see that imports start to compare. So what we're seeing here is that 0.2% down over the first 7 months of the year. But if we were to exclude January, that situation is actually a little bit worse. February through to July is down by almost 4%. And this is about the impact of the war in the Gulf countries. It's about the cost of living, trade with Europe. It's about obviously lower trade with the countries of West Asia or the Middle East, as it used to be called. And that's significant. So there is a question mark over demand for the second half of the year based on this analysis. And what we're seeing is, yeah, probably June, July, we saw a recovery in that trade, but it is vulnerable. So when we look at Vietnam, we see quite a good increase in imports. We see something of a decline in exports. We see volatility in exports. And I think this is accentuating the margin pressure that Vietnamese processors may be feeling. And I think that's bringing about a change in some processors' approach so that we don't see the extreme discounting or panic-stricken discounting of cashew kernels this year in the way that we saw it back, say, 2022, 2023, when economies and trade were in rather similar positions. Let's switch our focus to India. So India's imports, and again, we're talking about raw cashew nut imports to India in the first part of the year. In India's case, I don't have July figures yet, but we're talking therefore for the first half of the year. So first thing is, we can note that imports are healthy. They're up 9% versus 2025. They're up 22% versus 2024. Remember, 2024 suffered from quite a high carry-in inventory. But last year's imports were also very healthy in terms of the volume, and still demand goes up. So it looks as if, at least in the first half of the year and going into now the main festival seasons, that demand in India is quite healthy. There are some concerns on it, and I think the position is still unclear. If we look at a couple of factors that may well influence Indian demand, remember, India is the largest consumer of cashews in the world, far, far outstripping any other market. Probably 1 in 3 cashew nuts consumed in the world is consumed in India. So first of all, looking at the key factor, agriculture is still the driver of the Indian economy. The monsoon is the most important event for economic prosperity, prosperity of agriculture, and therefore is a main driver of the Indian economy. A deficit on the monsoon can affect the price of foods, fresh foods, but also dairy products and also longer term crop production. This year, at the 17th of August, we had a 13% decline in the cumulative rainfall during the monsoon. Now, that will have an impact. It's not a gigantic impact, but it is an impact, and it does contribute to the concern over demand in the second half in India. The other factor that's really significant, I think, bearing in mind that India imports 60% of the cashews that it consumes, mainly in raw cashew nut form. And what we're seeing here is the Indian rupee been sliding lower over the past, well, it's been happening for a long time, but certainly over the past year or so. So here's a chart from an outfit called TradingView, online out currency analysis. And we've seen a slippage of the rupee against the US dollar consistently over the past year. Indicators that that may well continue, although you can see that it has stabilized a little bit in recent days. What does it do? It makes imported raw cashew nuts more expensive. That's passed on down the chain. It makes life more difficult for processors, but it should probably make prices more difficult for consumers too. So the impact of this Iran-US war, combined with the deficit monsoon, combined with the weaker rupee, leads to some concerns in terms of Indian demand in the second half of the year. So I had a look to see if there's any evidence of that so far, and looking at some of the analysis, no, there isn't any evidence of that so far, interestingly enough. If we look at sales tax figures, consumer confidence remains resilient, remains relatively strong in India, but it does take time for these things to hit. So there's got to be a big question mark over demand in India in the second half of the year. And I think that's something that we need to be a little bit cautious about. The most recent crop estimate that I've seen is from APEDA. It's a 730,000 ton crop estimate. That would be better than last year, but not as good as hoped for. Earlier in the year, they had forecast 800,000 tons. But it is a better crop. Now, last year, India bought, I believe, about 1.25 million tons of raw cashew nuts. They're about halfway through that figure at this stage, at June. So it looks to be on target, but I would have some concerns about how that might pan out in the second half of the year. It will always be interesting to see. So then, trends and outlook in summary. On the supply side, inventories are getting tighter, inventories of raw cashew nuts. But at the same time, I think there's probably a prospect of some raw cashew nuts being carried out of the year. There were last year. The import figures in January and February confirm that for us. Tanzania still has a good crop forecast with some concerns around the inputs and some but lesser concerns around the weather. The Brazilian crop official forecast, the July forecast, is 152,000 tons. That's up 22% on last year. In the big picture, it doesn't make a huge difference, but it is a better crop, and that's a good thing to see. On the demand side, buyers, especially those who buy forward, I think they're covered for 2026. Top-ups are the most we can expect. Costs are high. We've talked about the weaker Indian rupee, and we've talked about concerns on the slowdown of imports. And that's been seen in the European Union, and it's been seen to a certain extent in China so far. What does that mean for prices? My only real concern on prices would be that there might be a cash flow pressure on Vietnamese processors, and that might cause them to engage in a little bit of a sell-off in September. May or may not happen. That cost of raw cashew nuts, that standoff or no parity, if you remember a webinar we did back in May, that was called No Parity, No Sweat. Why do RCN prices never match cashew kernels prices? Well, they don't, and they don't seem likely to do so anytime soon. But I do think that the combination of raw material prices, higher costs, is causing processors to be firmer in their pricing. And we are seeing a steadiness in the market now for several weeks that I think is likely to persist toward the end of the year. Now, once the new crop, if we get through flowering, if we get through a East African, Indonesian, Brazilian crop that comes in positively, that may change at the very end of the year or into the early next year. But we do need to be careful. El Nino can have a huge impact, and that's one of our potential disruptors. So things to watch out for that might disrupt this rather steady market would be impact of El Nino. First of all, how is that impact and when does it become known is the other factor. So it would be a key factor in Cambodia during flowering, for example, and it is Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, that could suffer the highest impact of El Nino, and that could affect cashew production. But it'll affect it during the flowering period, so we should get a signal of what's happening well in advance. It's going to make the Cambodia Cashew Forum, which is going to take place in early November. It's going to make that really interesting this year, its timing. It'd be really interesting to go and have a look in Cambodia during that period. Other factors, demand in India and a slowdown of demand in the Western countries, especially Europe. Bearing in mind that Europe has been a strong driver of demand in recent years. So some concerns on demand, some concerns on supply, but the concerns on supply are not yet realized. We're more or less thinking, what if on El Nino? And if you recall, we discussed that in a recent webinar and potential impact of that. Probably not in East Africa this year, but possibly in Southeast Asia this year, starting at the end of 2026 into 2027 harvest, and potentially in India again during flowering, but less likely in India. Seems unlikely to impact in West Africa, but there are other factors related to changes in the climate which could again impact West Africa in the coming year. And we're going to talk about some of those during the key lessons. So there we are, not too much volatility expected, but some big question marks over the market for the next 6 months or so. So let's have a look at some of these thoughts on key lessons from 2026. Now, everyone has their own lessons that they draw. We all have our own experiences, and we all will have different views on this. These are mine. First thing I think that comes to my mind is we need better crop forecasting. And I wanted to take the example of Côte d'Ivoire. It's not the only one, of course, but if you look at the progression of estimates from January, 1.6 million tons, a big crop estimated in Côte d'Ivoire by the CCRK, and that worked its way down to 1.3, down to 950. Then the trade came out and said, look, it's a little bit higher. It's around 1 million tons. And now we come up more or less from official sources, 1.3 to 1.35. And we think, based on calculations of trade, we think it's actually more likely to be around 1.4 million tons. So we see quite a big variation, and that's caused a lot of difficulty for people making decisions in business. And as I say, Côte d'Ivoire is not the only one. In Ghana, we have trade estimates anywhere from 160, even lower actually, up to 262,000 tons, the official estimate. Neither are right, I think, but we do need to find out what is right. In Nigeria, well, we know the crop was a little bit smaller this year than previous years, but we also know in many of the estimates that they have just lumped in what's rolling in from Benin for export, or some of it for processing indeed. They've lumped in what's rolling in. So you will see a crop estimate of 400,000 tons, and you will see crop estimates of 300,000 tons. The difference is what's coming from Benin. So these are factors, inaccurate forecasts that cause confusion and undermine confidence. Tanzania, similar situation. Take your pick. Estimates anywhere from 530 up to 700,000 tons. The Cashew Board estimates 617,000 tons. Mozambique, it's been there for a long time. Official IAM estimate, I think 195,000 tons. Trade says 130. Actual trade figures kind of confirm the trade figure more than the IAM figure at this point. And even in India, we see volatility. The high estimate was 810,000 tons, the most recent one, 730,000 tons. This is not about changing situations. This is about good or bad estimates. And if we look at Cote d'Ivoire, this is drawn from our webinar in the 15th of July. If we look at the progression over the course of the year, we had a weak harmattan. The first crop was lowered in 2025. Processors chased after the market. Then we came to when we were expecting the second flowering or the second flush. RCN traders thought it was all over. Some of them went on to other countries to buy, but it wasn't. The harvest was still going on well into July. Product was still being marketed well into July. And we go from forecasts of a very good to a very poor, and it ends up as the second largest crop in history. So first lesson for me, very clear, we need better crop forecasting. And it probably isn't simply putting up a few drones and taking pictures. It probably isn't satellite imagery analysis. It's a combination of all those things, but more than anything, it needs better analysis of the available data. Lesson 2. Cambodia, surprisingly for many, is still increasing. So step up. We've got at least 1 million tons this year, possibly more than 1.1 million tons. Trees were planted up to 3 years ago. Those trees are still maturing. Those trees are still offering more and more product. Every February, we're hearing in Cambodia, there's a problem with this crop. It'll be the same, it'll be lower. Everyone's singing the same song. But by June, we've got bigger crops every year in each of the last 5 years. This is not going to change, and it's having an impact. Cambodia is having a major impact. And if we look at first factor, earlier production. So Cambodian raw cashew nuts are coming in from Jan-Feb onwards. This means that Vietnam's processors, who mainly buy this, are buying later in West Africa. So a big impact in West Africa. There's also higher quality production. So what we're getting is we're getting much higher yielding on average from Cambodia and much larger nuts from Cambodia. So this doesn't sit very well with the longer term approach in Vietnam, which was essentially this idea of lower quality, lower cost. Let's water down the specifications. Let's meet price points for buyers. Very smart move. Worked very well for a long time. And then the buyers got into this idea, particularly of affordable cashews or lower cost cashews to boost demand. Did it work? Yeah, it really worked well, but it doesn't fit with having 1 million tons of large, high quality nuts. Now that the emphasis starts to swing back, how do we make the most of these premium products? If we don't make the most of the premium products, what will happen in Cambodia? Will farmers remove trees? They've done it before. A little bit on cashews, but they've done it on other products too. It's also happened in Vietnam. What would happen if these large cashew nuts don't work for farmers? Well, they wouldn't produce them. If they don't produce them, that would put Vietnamese processors' dependence back on Africa, where costs are rising, export taxes are rising, processing is rising. Again, it would create huge supply chain pressure for Vietnamese processors. So they need to find markets that can offer premium prices. And so far, they've done a great job on that. But it has changed the way people buy their raw cashew nuts. It means that there is a shorter buying window. That product from Cambodia comes earlier. They need more working capital to finance it. It's higher cost, it's big volume, and it's in a much more compact time period, and it impacts cash flow. It doesn't necessarily impact profit margin. You can still make money, but it does impact your cash flow and the need for money. And that's got to be reflected somewhere. And where it's reflected is in West Africa. It's reflected in slower buying in West Africa. So the product takes longer time to move. Now, that's less noticed just now because most governments have introduced windows during which exports are banned and their local processors can buy. Those are a good idea. And they serve their purpose. But meantime, material starts to build up. There's more need for infrastructure, more need for warehouses, more need for better post-harvest handling, because the quality of the product, particularly in countries like Côte d'Ivoire, where there is a rainy harvest, the quality will decline. And you see that, and that is rolling and getting greater and greater every year. So it all comes down to higher costs. It comes down to processors being in a position where they are far less likely to discount prices in the way that we saw in the second half of 2022 and 2023 into the first 4 months of 2024 when prices spiked back up. And those are roughly where we are today. Haven't really changed that much since then. So I think we are seeing a fundamental change as an impact of Cambodian production. And I don't think Cambodia has stopped increasing its production just yet. Cambodian farmers are being rewarded with decent prices, decent yields. Why would they stop planting trees? Well, they won't. That's the simple answer to it. Interesting impact. Tanzanian production can have a similar impact. I might come back to that.